Hi, AP students. We are moving forward today. We're going to talk about banking transactions. If you haven't watched the previous video about the money multiplier and how banks create money, you'll want to do that. This is just kind of taking that at the next step and looking at, I guess you could say, how banks keep track of how much money they are able to create, so to speak. All right, so we're moving along those notes here. At the top, they look like this. This is the stuff we did in a previous video, and then we're scrolling down here. We're starting right about here. These liabilities for banks. Okay, so pretty simple concept. It's going to take some time. Kind of bear with me here. I got to do a lot of writing on my screen, so forgive me in advance for the sloppy handwriting. But hopefully, that's not a reason to not learn this stuff. So anyway, we're going to categorize banks money, okay, the money in banks and with two different things. They have assets, okay, that's the things that they own and they can use to make money, all right. They're going to be referred to a few different things here: reserves, excess reserves. You can kind of read through that. And then they also have liabilities, and these are things that they could potentially owe people, okay, or are owed to people, okay. So, for example, the one we want to be most familiar with is a checkable deposit, where that would be like your savings account or your checking account, the money banks use to loan out to people. Now, the simplest concept to understand here is that banks' assets and their liabilities have to equal each other. So notice in this case, we're going to make them equal 250. And as you can see, different things are going to cause these liabilities. Checkable deposits are what we're going to get most familiar with, but you might see some other terms as you kind of move forward through some things. Like I said, we're going to focus on checkable deposits here in the future. But notice all these things are equaling $250. Over here, a question that you might run across is, here's the required reserves, here's the excess reserves, the loans, and they're going to say, okay, well, what else does the bank have, is the bank responsible for? So other securities, whatever that is, that could be bonds from the federal government or whatever. It has to be 100 because these have to equal 250. It's a good way that you can check your work. Like I said, sometimes they'll give you all these numbers and they'll say, okay, well, what are the required reserves? It's probably a little bit more of a common question than solving for the other section. All right. So we're going to go through this halfway book here. All right, kind of going in regards to some different transaction that a bank is going to experience. And so, anyway, we start out here. We have a 10% reserve requirement. That's something that we're always going to need to find first. Otherwise, we can't figure out the required reserves and eventually the excess reserves, the money they can loan out. So this particular bank starts out with $100,000 in checkable deposits. Okay, with that 10% reserve requirement, what we know, okay, is that this has to equal 100,000, and that 10% of 100,000, those are our required reserves. So that is what we need to eventually be able to list there. Okay, in our second step, okay, we have no new deposits. Okay, but notice we have a $50,000 loan taken out. We want to keep track of our total checkable deposits. Our excess and required reserves are going to change a tad. Our required reserves are not going to change. We still have $100,000 in checkable deposits. Okay, so we still have that same reserve requirement. Now we have a $50,000 loan out. Okay, so 50 plus 10,000 is 60,000. We can do some math with it too. All right, but we can say, all right, if we have a reserve requirement of 10, a $50,000 loan, we can figure out our excess reserves in that 40,000. Okay, we can also kind of keep track and say, well, 90,000 minus 50,000 is 40,000. We could do that. All right. Here's our next step: is we're going to add $100,000 deposit. Okay. So now our total checkable deposits are $200,000. Okay. We've still got this $50,000 loan out. Our required reserves are going to change a little bit. Remember, we've got $200,000 in here now. So our required reserves are going to be $220,000. That's something that is a little bit tougher to remember. The more you write down, sometimes the better it is, the easier it is to keep track of things. All this stuff has to equal $200,000. So we know in this case that we've got 130,000 in excess reserves. Okay. Our last step, the last thing that kind of can change the situation is that there's going to be a withdrawal of cash. In this case, we say $50,000. Our checkable deposits decrease to $150,000. That's going to change our required reserves. Our loans are still the same, okay? In the real world, they'll probably have obviously loan payments coming back in and all that type of stuff. They make it a little bit simpler for us in terms of what they are asking us to figure out on a situation to situation basis. We know that all that stuff has to equal 150,000. We've got $85,000 in excess reserves. So each one obviously kind of becomes its own little algebra problem based on different variables, whether it be the amount of loans that have been taken out, or whether it be the amount of deposits or withdrawals there are. And then we've got to kind of, process of elimination, figure out the required reserves, how much loans are out, and then how much excess reserves, there are left. Okay. So we're going to do a little bit more complicated one here. Okay. Um, I'm going to move back and forth. I'll show you how I'm going to set this up. And this is where I've got to do some writing and stuff. So kind of bear with me as we go through it. Okay. So we're assuming that this bank, well, first of all, we got to know the math, right? We're going to say a 10% deposit, I'm sorry, 10% reserve requirement. And then we're going to say that they start out with $0. Okay. So we're just going to assume that that's where they're at. And then I'm going to kind of fill this in as we go down here the best that I can. It might take more than one slide. There's going to be obviously several different things. And what I would like you to do is as you go through is as you go through pause it each time and see if you're matching up with what I eventually come up with. Okay, so for number one here, all you need to figure out with that 50,000 is your total deposits. I'm sorry, your excess reserves and your required reserves. Okay, so go ahead and kind of think about that. I'm going to solve it here in real time as we go. All right, so we've got 50,000 in deposits. And sometimes you'll see demand deposits, you'll see checkable deposits. It's all going to mean the same thing for us. So for number one here, we have required and we have excess. We know required is 10% of our deposits. That's going to be $5,000. We know that this has to equal $50,000. So this is $45,000. Again, keep in mind, this equals 50,000. Okay. I'm going to draw a little line under there so I can separate it. You don't have to draw the line. I usually number it as well. I kind of forgot right there. So anyway, let's go on to the next step here. We've got a loan issued at $10,000. Okay, now we don't see anything about deposits. We've got total deposits still at 50,000. We can kind of keep track of that. I'm going to abbreviate with the DEP. All right. We know that if we know our deposits are at 50,000, we know that our required equals 5,000. All right. We know that we have a loan for 10,000. All right. And now we know that all this has to equal 50,000 still. So what are our excess? Well, our excess are going to be $35,000. All right. And again, all that equals 50,000. We're moving right along here. Okay. What's our next step? We have a deposit of 30,000. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of keep track, and I'm going to say just to keep my numbers straight as we go through this, I had plus 30,000. Okay, so we have an equals 80,000 total. I'm gonna put a box around it so I know that I don't lose that number. All right, now over here, it doesn't really say anything changes, okay, but our reserve requirement definitely does. 10% of 80,000 equals 8,000. We still have a loan out of 10,000, right? And now we've got to figure out our excess. Changes our number a little bit. Remember, this has got to equal 80,000 now. Figure all that math out. You're going to have $62,000 in excess excess funds. Okay. All right, we're moving on to the next one. If you're stuck, again, pause it here, and especially for this one, when we have a new loan issued, we're on number 4. Okay, pause it, see if you can figure out what needs to happen and what your banking sheet is going to look like. Okay, I'm gonna draw my new line. We're gonna do number 4 here. So, like I said, we have a new loan, $20,000. So I'm just going to say, all right, we don't have anything new over here. I'm going to keep this. We got 80,000 total, right? And again, these are deposits. I keep saying total just out of habit, okay? So these are deposits. Well, our required reserves stay the same, 8,000. We have a loan of 10,000, and now we have a new loan of another 20,000. So I'm just going to call this loan 1 to keep them separate. And then I got loan 2 is 20,000, right? And now I've got to figure out my excess reserves again. Not too hard if you know what you're doing, right? This still has to equal 80,000. So my excess now becomes $42,000, right? And I separated these two loans just to keep my math straight, okay? Just so I can see what's going on. Okay. Our next step, we've got a withdrawal of $20,000. Now, this kind of changes things a little bit here, obviously, because we've got to figure out a new reserve requirement. So we've got a withdrawal here of 20,000. Number 5. All right, so now our new total is $60,000 in deposits. Okay, and again, if you're not seeing how I got that, we took 20,000 out of this 80,000. We have a new total of 60,000. I'll put a box around to keep it straight. Now, one thing we know is we have loans out from our previous of $30,000. So we know that. We can write that right now. We also have a new required of 10% of 60,000, which is 6,000. All right. And we've got to figure out now what is our excess. Okay, well, that equals 36,000. We've got to get to 60,000. Do some quick math there. Our excess reserves are $24,000. Okay, hopefully you're getting matched up with that. Hopefully you're following along with what we're trying to do here. All right, moving forward here, and this is way more complicated than what you'll see. You'll usually see, like on a test situation, you only have like one thing to do. Obviously, we're covering different scenarios, within the same bank. If you can do what we're doing here, you're going to be in really good shape on a test situation when you get to the point where you're trying to figure out excess reserves and stuff. Okay, so we've got a new loan issued of $10,000. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I've got loans. I'm just going to say 1 equals 30,000 just because that's going to distinguish what it was before. And I've got loans 2 at 10,000. it kind of gives me a few different things I have to memorize. My required is still 6,000, and my excess, right, is to be determined. But remember, we got to have all these equal 60,000 bucks. Well, 40,000, 46,000. That gets me down to a $14,000 in excess returns. Over here, my total is still $60,000. All right. Let's go to the next step here. Okay, is number 7. Our Federal Reserve is going to change the reserve requirements to 20%. All right. And now, those of you that are remembering, you know that is going to decrease how much money can be loaned out. All right. So they're changing the reserve requirements to 20%. Our total over here stays the same. All right. Our loans are staying the same. We have $40,000 in loans now. Our required reserves are what's going to change. And in this case, 20% of 60,000 is going to be $12,000. And now our excess reserves are only going to be $8,000. So notice what that does when they change that reserve requirement, it really changes these excess reserves. Okay, and obviously it's going to change. The bank can only loan out those excess reserves, so that's going to obviously decrease how much we're able to borrow. They're going to fix that, or I'm sorry, adjust that by raising interest rates. All right, let's talk about our last section here. All right, where we are going to see another withdrawal of $20,000. Okay, so we have another withdrawal. We've got minus 20,000. So now our total deposits equal $40,000. All right. So all of our stuff here is going to have to eventually equal 40,000. We'll just write that in there ahead of time. Our loans are going to stay the same. Got $40,000 in loans. Our required reserves is going to stay the same. We've got to get $12,000 in those required reserves. I'm backwards. Our total deposit is 40,000. Our required is 8,000. I apologize. Okay, I was one C. That's how you get yourself mixed up. You get going too fast. So our required reserves are 8,000 because of this withdrawal, right? So make sure that you're making that connection. Now, our excess reserves, we have a problem. We don't have any excess reserves anymore, right? And we've got to make this equal 40,000. Well, all our loans are out. We are $8,000 under our requirement. So we can put a negative number in the excess. So we can say 40,000 plus 8,000 minus 8,000. Now that equals 40,000. So we don't have any excess. Our requirement, we are not meeting our requirement. So what are the options for the bank if they get into this situation? That's our last part of our problem here. What is the bank now forced to do? Well, when they don't have the money to cover their required reserves, they must borrow from either the Fed or another bank. That's your prime rate, your federal funds rate. That's that second of the 3 ways that the Federal Reserve, makes sure that banks are following rules, right? That's kind of, we've compared to the speed limit before, where if a speed limit fine, where the government kind of wants you to speed a little bit. That's why the fine isn't over the top, but they don't want you to be extremely reckless, right? So it is still a solid chunk of money. All right. Go ahead and take a second here and we'll give you a chance to do this problem here. All right, I'm going to pause my video, but you're going to answer these questions. Okay, take a shot at it, see how good you are, and then we'll do it together to make sure that we're getting the right stuff done. All right, guys. Hopefully you had a chance to get this problem halfway solved here. If not, once I kind of give you something that you couldn't find, maybe you kind of go back and double check, what you could do a little bit better. So we're going to start off here with our reserve requirement for Terra Bank, which is not given to us. What we do know is, though, that this and this have to equal each other. So we know that it equals 100,000, and we know that our required reserves are 10,000. So we know that 10,000 is 10% of 100,000, which is a 10% rate. Okay. Now, Lewis here is going to withdraw $9,500. Okay. Or I'm sorry, $500. I got my 95 mixed up. So now we kind of change this number. I want to try to keep track of stuff as good as possible for you. We change our demand deposits here to $95,000. Okay. Well, that's going to change some things. It's going to change our required reserves to 9,500. Right? It's going to change our excess reserves to, in this case, sorry, 9,500. It's going to change our excess reserves here to only $500. And how did I get that number? Well, I took 85,000 plus 9,500, and that got me 94,500. And remember, I know that all this stuff here has to equal this $95,000. Okay, so by how much will the bank's reserves change based on its withdrawal? Well, they are going to decrease by $4,500. All right. What is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money? Explain. Remember, M1 money, okay, is cash on hand. It's going to increase it by $5,000 until it gets deposited by someone that he spends it at, right? Simple concept. You just got to remember those definitions of M1 money. As a result of that withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of Terra Bank based on the reserve requirement figured above? Our excess reserves, we've already figured that out. It's $500. Okay. Let me go back. I got ahead of myself. This should not be 4,500. This is just talking about the reserves. The overall reserves is going to change from 15,000, and this is my fault on the verbiage, from 15,000 now to 10,000. Okay, and maybe they want you to say it goes down by $5,000. Okay, either way, what we were saying was eventually correct. However you decided to say that, that would be correct. Okay, so they want your reserves added together in that particular case. So anyway, their reserves are now 10,000. They went down by 5,000. Okay. So anyway, sometimes they make you word things that way. I apologize for that quick little mess up there. All right, we got that. Assume the next day John withdraws from Terra Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves, assuming no loans are called in. How can Terra Bank cover its required reserves? So what's it's saying is that nobody made any loan payments. That's what they're saying. No loans are paid off. That makes sense, right? Okay, so what do? Same thing as our practice problem a little bit ago. They can either borrow from another bank or the Fed. All right. I hope this is starting to make sense. It will be an assignment for you on my AP. And while we continue to get better at these things, keep practicing them, and hopefully we are getting better.